Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Guy Platten, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping. Guy was appointed Secretary General of the ICS in 2018, and over a very short few years, Guy, I would imagine you didn't expect to see so many turbulent, historic moments that perhaps your predecessors would have had over many decades. You've had lumped into one few years. As we sit here at the end of 2022, shipping seems to have faced everything in the sort of COVID years and coming out of COVID. Generally, if we might start with the big picture sense of where is shipping now? China's still in lockdown, of course, with COVID. That has an impact on shipping. And where's the shipping sector in 2022?
Oh, thanks so much, Sean. I think the proverb, Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. It's a curse, but it certainly has been a very, very interesting few years, that's for sure. From COVID to and of course the conflict in Ukraine, plus everything else, the headwinds which we're experiencing as a world in terms of an energy crisis and the climate change as well. So all of them keep conspiring together, but it keeps you busy.
I mean, the last time we talked, it was about the minute logistics of simply managing crew changes and what a massive challenge the most simplest of tasks were during the height of COVID.
And we've still got some of that going on. I mean, you mentioned China does seem to go into lockdowns at times as well, which has impact on the supply chain. We've still got bottlenecks in ports. We're still, there's a shortage of seafarers, there's a shortage of truck drivers. All these things impact on the overall supply chain. There's no doubt what did take us all by surprise was how resilient the industry was during the pandemic times. Suddenly that people had to spare cash to order stuff from Amazon, which meant busy times to the container lines and the like. We've seen just all sorts of, we had that spectacle of the oil price being negative at the start of COVID, and now the prices with the conflict in Ukraine pushing up prices around the globe as well. So it's a really complex time. But one thing that always strikes me about shipping, why I love the industry so much, is we're a very resilient industry. We'll find our ways around things. So we're a solution finder when it comes to these sort of headwinds.
Well, if you look at the point where we started, maybe our last conversation, and where like many industries have suffered the great resignation, the great retirement, and in oil production struggling in the US, for example, not from the lack of money, but from the lack of talent availability to come back to the oil and gas production. What has been the impact on shipping with the great resignation?
Undoubtedly, it's having an increasing impact. We estimate that by 2025, will be 96,000 certificated officers short in our industry. And that's a huge number. And let's be honest, during the pandemic, when crews couldn't get off the ship and they couldn't go home, it was hardly the best recruitment poster for a life at sea. So we have those sort of issues to get over as well. And so I think this is symptomatic of most industries now. It's struggling to get talent. And as we reset ourselves in coming out of COVID and into the recovery that there is at the moment, so it's really interesting times. So it's fascinating.
And when you say 96,000, what does that represent in percentage terms? That's a very big percentage.
That's with about 1.8 million seafarers, so it's about 6%, something like 6%.
Yeah.
But these are officers as well. That 1.8 million includes ratings as well as officers. So it's a significant number, and it's being able to try and sell our industry to young people as one which is worth joining, which is very rewarding for you, both professionally and also financially as well, for supporting families. So we've got a big job to do. We're working with governments to address that. But certainly it's the same with many other logistics in the supply chains. Struggling to get the right people is something which seems to be very common out there.
And looking at some of the logistics challenges that have domino effects into crew changes and many others, but is the bottlenecks at different ports around the world. We saw during the height of COVID off the coast of California, ships were waiting literally weeks to unload. Similarly experiencing that off the coast of China around Shanghai and other areas. Where are those sort of bottlenecks at now in terms of ship waiting times for offloading, and what are the domino consequences of that?
It's interesting. It does vary. I think a lot of those backlogs have eased somewhat, that's for sure. But then all you need is a new lockdown to be imposed, and those bottlenecks reappear. Because if a ship's waiting around to load a cargo or discharge a cargo, then clearly it's not being able to transport another cargo somewhere else. So you get this knock-on effect. We are seeing a softening in the container rates quite markedly. I was with some senior person earlier today who said that how it's now back to almost pre-pandemic levels now as well, and we can only see it perhaps get worsening as the world perhaps goes to a downturn. We're sort of, we're hearing things about that, which will then have a knock-on effect with shipping. Shipping is often a good barometer as to how the world's doing. We're some early indications are that those rates are coming down. It depends which sector you're in, but there's no doubt there's a correction on its way, I think.
When you look at sort of the challenges the world faces now at the end of 22 going into 23, there are the geopolitical crises that seem to have trumped the sort of supply bottlenecks. And the first one I wanted just to tackle with you was the upcoming boycott on insurance cover. We saw the UK announce last week that they weren't going to provide insurance cover for marine oil cargoes coming out of Russia. Where does the sanctions on marine activity impact, or where is it likely to go, and consequences of it?
Firstly, there's some confusion around that as well, because you've got the oil price cap, I think, coming in in early December, followed by for the rest of the world, and making sure that ship owners are inadvertently without cover because they somehow technically breach a sanction without them knowing. For example, ship owners don't generally own the cargo. That's negotiated by the cargo owner. So you can't be necessarily sure. You have to rely on what you're told to a great deal on that. So we're working through the detail, and we've been speaking to finance ministries in the United States and in Europe as well, so we can get a better understanding of how this is going to work, because it's really important just for anti-pollution and other things that ships are insured going forward. So that's something no ship owner wants to break sanctions, of course. So it's working through that minefield, which is the sanctions, to make sure people are compliant. So something we're looking at very, very carefully going forward, and how we can advise our members the best thing to do.
I mean, when you consider that, I mean, sanctions on sanctions, I mean, in some ways, we're nearly getting a situation where, the geography of sanctions is bigger than the geography of non-sanctions, and the ports of countries and companies that are complying and those that aren't. Is this manageable? Is it, I mean, putting aside judgment as whether it's right or wrong, but just the logistics of managing this scale of sanctions, is it even manageable? Is it viable for ship owners, ship charterers to have that burden and still operate?
I think everyone works their way through it, and I think there is a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of hoops to go through in order to get there. But shipping is resilient, as I mentioned earlier. We do find a way to safely and probably manage these situations, and we have to live with the cards that we've been dealt, quite honestly. So it's about making it work, whatever it is, and understanding. But it's also making it clear to governments the law of unintended consequences. By introducing something, it might have a wrong effect elsewhere, which wasn't the intention of it. So part of our job is to work our way through it, but also to point out, where, for example, on the cargo side of it, with the oil price cap, making sure if a ship owner inadvertently loads a cargo above the price cap because they wasn't aware, will they be sanctioned or not? It's trying to get this understanding through the system, and I'm very pleased with the talks we've had so far. At least there's an understanding how shipping, the complex nature of shipping with so many different contracts around, and how it all gets glued together. So that's something we are very much working through. But I mean,
it has to be said that the upshot of a lot of these disruptions over the last few years, ship owners and charters have done very well out of, monetarily, have been making a significant margin. We talked earlier about container rates are up at $10,000+ a container. Big bucks for ship owners.
Completely, yeah. I think no one would deny that it's been a very lucrative couple of years, I think, for ship owners. But of course, there's the other side of the coin, is when there's many years when you make little or no profit as well. And you can see the good times, if you like, are starting to come to an end, and we're going to go through a period, I think, contraction and of much more negative rates being able to be charged. So let's see how the next year pans out. But certainly the indications are, with container rates coming well off their highs now and likely to continue with what we're hearing is many are now overstocked with goods. So there's going to be a reduced demand for shipping. So we'll see that translate, no doubt.
But meanwhile, VLCC tanker rates are going through the roof. Went over $100,000 recently. With these sort of dislocations, we're seeing VLCCs making journeys that they haven't made before, with oil flowing in different directions, obviously European, Russian oil into Asia and such things. How is this dislocation impacting shipping, these new flows, if you like?
I think it finds a way around. Trade always finds a way around and to be compliant. But you're right. If you've got a ship on a longer voyage to take a particular cargo, then obviously that's going to cost more money to do so. So it's about readjusting the whole sort of network, the interconnected network of shipping, as it tries to cope with the geopolitics which we're seeing play out before us.
And is that adjustment happening? I mean, one of the things that are facing operators, if you like, producers of energy and refiners and so forth, is to make an assessment on whether these change flows are temporary, or are they permanent, or are they temporary for what amount of time? How does that judgment impact decision making for shippers?
I think what happens at the end of the day is the ship owners will provide the ships which are available to meet the needs of the cargo owners and to shift in the cargo. And if you've got longer routes, that's clearly going to impact on the rates, and those rates will go up. But you can't just magic up a load of more ships. They take time to build, and the order book is not very full for particularly on the tanker side of it as well. So you've got this limited supply and excess demand because you've changed the way. This is bound to impact on rates. But these things are they're transient, they settles down over time. So it's about what the long-term prospects are going to be. And at the moment, it's really difficult to call what those are going to be. I think the geopolitics, I think there's some way to go before we see what is perhaps a new order emerging. And I think that period of change now is something that we're all having to live through.
Well, one of the things to look at there in the context of the changes was the move to the east, if you like, from the point of view of the opportunity of the Russian and oil, but also products. And so moving from the west to the east, and shippers also taking that opportunity. But in the midst of all of that sort of challenge of new flows, is coming off the back of a period in which there was an acceleration to scrap ships, that there was a surplus and a lot of floating sort of service vehicle ships for the oil offshore and so forth. The accelerated scrapping, where is that at this stage?
I think this is a typical shipping market, is that you get an excess capacity, so more ships are scrapped, then demand picks up and you need to build more assets. It seems to have been the way for many hundreds of years, if we're honest. So we're going through these cycles, but shipping will always come through, will always be resilient. But when you have these period of flux and period of change, it does impact on the availability of ships.
Where were we in that cycle at the moment? I mean, from accelerated sort of scrapping going into COVID, where are we now?
So just take the container market for an example, is that there's lots of new container ships on order just at a time where demand is falling. So you're going to suddenly have an excess capacity probably in a year or so's time when these ships start to come on stream. And this is the same with the offshore supply industry. If you cast your mind back to 2015, 2016, there were just so much laid up tonnage. And some of that was scrapped, as you say, but now of course there's a pickup in demand for these things. So it's the market always determines,
and there isn't availability. Quite often there's the capex is available for development, exploration, development of new capacity offshore, and yet the supply chain equipment is not there at the moment, and so consequently we're seeing this tightness in the market.
And which is good if you're the owner of those assets, that's for sure.
But you're not if you just scrapped one at a barge or two a year or two ago, then you'd be a little bit disappointed.
I'm sure you would be, but I mean, they're obviously making good margins on the assets they do have. So, I mean, and I say shipping is very cyclical. So you're going to get this boom and bust sort of, it keeps repeating itself a little bit. And at the moment, for some sectors, it's really good rates being held, good firm rates. But, you know, these things pass eventually as more tonnage comes in and things built and things catch up from it all. So I always think, you know, it's very difficult to call more than a few months ahead sometimes.
We're having our conversation during the first week of COP27, and we just want to get a sense of where this sort of energy transition is for shipping. The last time we had a deep conversation was just in the aftermath of the IMO 2020 rule that had come in. So perhaps that's a good place to start, just to get an update 2 years later. IMO 2020, where is that at the most? Shipping has adapted. How has the impact been?
So I think 2020 seems such a long time ago now.
I know. It's like multiple generations ago.
It certainly is not something which crosses my desk every day now, whereas leading up to 2020, it absolutely did. Certainly the decarbonisation agenda is very much there.
Yes.
You know, and shipping's commitment to its own decarbonisation, that we want to be net zero by 2050. But what are those new alternative fuels going to be? One thing we do know, there's an opportunity for shipping here, because shipping may use 4% of fuels, but 96% are carried. So it's that 96%. And we do know these clean new fuel, these green fuels will change trade patterns, I have no doubt. And also you're going to need ships to transport these clean fuels. We've done some work with governments, you know, and they have some great ideas for producing the renewable fuels. And we say, well, how are you going to ship them to your market? Because you can't, you know, we need to start understanding what those fuels are likely to be.
What about the last year? We're out of COP26 in Glasgow with you know, very strong wind in the sails of the energy transition. And if you were making decisions then in the first quarter, let's say pre-Ukraine, you might have made a certain judgment that the future was going to look a certain way in terms of decarbonization time horizons. Now, 6 months later, energy security has really taken over the narrative and the priority. How does that impact, if you like, the decisions or the judgments for the shipping industry?
It's interesting you say that, because obviously in the short term, it's people wanting to secure their energy supplies, and we absolutely get that. But the long term, is that going to mean more of a push for renewable energy, produced more locally? I think that's something that we'll see how that plays out. There's a lot of rhetoric given by politicians. What we're trying to do is establish what's the difference between rhetoric and what's actually happening on the ground. We have this concept called Clean Energy Marine Hubs, which we launched a few weeks ago at the Clean Energy Ministerial in Pittsburgh, which is trying to get the public sector, trying to get the private sector, and throughout the value supply chain to understand what these new fuels are going to be, and to make sure that it's done in a logical way, so that the fuels are produced, the port's able to transport the fuels elsewhere to need on the market. So that's something we're working very hard on. We in fact have an announcement today at COP27. My chairman is announcing it there at the Leaders Summit today at COP27, and I shall be there later this week as well to talk more about this. But there's no doubt the shipping industry is, if you like, got the memo, and it recognizing the need to transition. Now it's
net zero by 2050, that seems like a big horizon away. What are the milestones in between?
Well, it isn't, if you think about it. That's what, 27 years away.
I mean, it's not, but ultimately there's got to be some tangible stepping stones.
Absolutely.
Or else we're all going to go off the rails.
So what we believe is an achievable target is to have 5% use of clean fuels by 2030. And then it will start to accelerate. So but there's some things that need to happen to make, and that's where governments need to come in. We're not asking for money or handouts. That's not what we're asking for. It's good proportionate regulation that gives financial certainty to unlock the investment that is needed. And that's where we need governments to show true leadership now. So, for example, we have a proposal in for a market-based economic measure, so that there's a price per ton of CO2 that ships may emit, and perhaps the opportunity to draw some money out if ships are emitting zero fuel, to try and bridge that gap between the clean fuels and the fossil fuels they burn. But that needs regulation to put in place, and needs governments to come together. We need some sort of fuel standards as well. So all these things are in the gift of governments to agree, because we want that on an international basis, on a global basis, in order to create that level playing field and actually achieve the aim, So there's real intent, I sense, among ship owners to make this happen. What we need now is that regulatory certainty. And that's when we need true leadership from governments now, how that's going to go forward, and to make sure both developed and developing nations are able to go on this journey together.
When you think of other big trends like decarbonization, which of course has still some regulatory uncertainty around it, but also is this the idea of the supply chain restructuring. We talked about new energy flows coming out of COVID. We're also seeing the big narrative around restructuring of supply chains, not only for lower carbon purposes, where you would relocate manufacturing closer to consumers, but also because of the geopolitics as well. But those big trends, how do they look like to ship owners? How could they change some of the decision making?
I think what you see now is uncertainty. There's a real uncertainty. What are those clean fuels going to be? How is it going to look like? Where they're going to be produced? There's uncertainty in all these different things, which makes it very difficult for long-term planning, because the last thing a ship owner wants to be left with is stranded assets, which are not going to be used. So I think I'm hoping they get some clarity in the next year or so to head, so we can get some much more idea of a roadmap. So we need our global regulator, the International Maritime Organization, to come together properly to de-risk some of that uncertainty, to allow proper planning to take place. And I think as an industry, to have a conference where a ship owner stands up and says, I want more regulation, that must be a first for a business person to be able to say that.
It's also the idea of where is China going? When you think of container shipping, I mean, the idea that China will remain or not remain the manufacturing center of the world, and that could change a lot of planning around ship profiles, new builds. What does that look like to you, given their declared intentions to become a more consumer knowledge economy, less interested in manufacturing cheap Barbie dolls?
Well, you see, I mean, this manufacturers is shifting to all sorts of new markets as we speak, as you know, Vietnam and other places like that. So we see that going on all the time. And shipping, the great thing about shipping, of course, it can move. You know, it can.
Well, you're not confined to a road, are you?
No, we're not. So we do have a distinct advantage there. Is that, and as we're seeing during all these geopolitics playing out, shipping is very resilient and is able to readjust to meet the needs of customers and needs to meet the needs of markets. But sometimes when there's uncertainty, that does obviously impact on rates, and obviously there's some uncertainty about the way ahead as well. But you know, one thing I'm confident on is that with 90% of everything traveling by sea at some point in its journey, there's going to be a need for shipping well into the future.
Let's just wrap up with the sort of final sort of hope and expectation. COP27 has come at a very difficult time, you would think, with the geopolitical backdrop of the world, distracted by not only global recession and other things, but war, obviously, in Europe. What do you think is a realistic expectation for the COP27, or what, not what you hope, but ultimately what do you think is realistic in this current moment, and also to an extent what you hope?
I think it is to keep the dialogue going. I think that's the real essential thing from this COP27 in Egypt. I don't think we're going to see any grand announcements so much.
I mean, it is the implementation COP. Yeah. That's the burden of the headline it goes in with, but.
So we'll see. I mean, I'll you know, ask me this question in a week's time after I've been there and sensed the mood of the conference. Really, I think is what I'd say, and I'm looking forward.
I mean, I hear you saying that you want clarity from policymakers for governments to be brave to set out some very clear roadmaps.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it's trying to look beyond the rhetoric, because it's very easy to make a rhetorical speech with your ambitions, and they're all good. They're needed. It's changing that into direct policy action that translates ultimately into rules and regulations that we can then deal with. So it's taking those promises and turning them into reality. And we need our governments to work together in order to do that. We're a servant of trade in such a way. We will adapt and react accordingly, but it just needs that certainty now. And you know, we do want governments to actually go beyond just rhetoric now.
Well, we just published a report today that had as its headline that volatility can only be removed by certainty. And that clearly is a scarce commodity at the moment. We'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Guy Platten, for being on Halftime Talk this week. Of course, Guy is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Shipping, who are heavily engaged in this year's COP27. And let's wish you the best, that all of your aspirations for COP deliver on some level. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you very much, Sean. Pleasure to be here.